werewolf is a mythological animal and the subject of many nightmarish stories throughout the world. According to legend, werewolves are people who transform into monstrously powerful and vicious wolves. Others are a mutant combination of human and wolf. All are bloodthirsty beasts who cannot control their lust for murder.
I have a question for you. How did we go from the bone-chilling description I just read to this man with fur on his face? An oddly popular monster who I, even as a child, found to be more on the comedic side than the actual scary side. To me, this one has always been a, oh man, you can totally see the zipper on the monster type of situation. I'm sure many disagree with me, but today we will find out how the horrifying legend of the werewolf became the Wolfman. And a little disclaimer, I'm making this video right before the new Wolfman is supposed to come out in 2025, so maybe my opinion of him will change and I'll be a total convert. I hope so. I love the concept of the werewolf. Most are just too cartoony like Michael J. Fox and Teen Wolf, which makes sense in a comedy. Or the practical effects in the movie are just not great. And the rest just use way too much CGI. Although I do enjoy the werewolves and all the effects of the Underworld movies. They did a great job of mixing the two. I'm interested to see if the new Wolfman does something similar.
Unlike his brethren, Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, who both come from amazingly written novels, the Wolfman does not have one particular source that we can point to for his origin. His beginning is shrouded in as much mystery as the full moon that summons him. Stay tuned as we dive into his history and what the newest interpretation has to offer in this full moon edition of Story Behind the Story. The Wolfman's genesis starts with the myths of long ago. We can then trace their path to where they culminate with the bastardization of its current form, which is typical of modern-day Hollywood. Why do I say that? Well, in traditional mythology, a werewolf was a human that has the ability to transform into a large wolf, whether that be at midnight, usually involuntarily and during a full moon, or on command. Weirdly enough, Twilight of all things went in the direction of traditional mythology when it comes to werewolves, although in their original forms vampires are affected by sunlight similar to what the Twilight franchise shows. In the mythology he based Dracula on, sunlight doesn't actually kill a vampire, so in a way, Stephenie Meyer's interpretation was actually pretty traditional, except for the sparkly part that is. Watch until the end of this video if you want to find out more about Dracula and Frankenstein's monster.
But now, we'll go into detail about the mythological origins of the werewolf. History.com gives a lot of good information on the history of werewolves. That link, as well as a more in-depth one about werewolf trials in Europe, similar to the Salem witch trials, are in the description.
Tales of werewolves go back thousands of years. Some scholars believe werewolves were first mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh jilted a potential lover because she'd turned her previous mate into a wolf. In Greek mythology, Lycaon, the son of Pelasgus, angered Zeus when he served him a meal made from the remains of a sacrificed boy. As punishment, the enraged Zeus turned Lycaon and his sons into wolves. In early Nordic folklore, wolf pelts had the power to turn people into wolves for a number of days. The saga of the Volsungs tells the story of a father and son who discovered wolf pelts that had the power to turn people into wolves for 10 days. The father-son duo donned the pelts, transformed into wolves, and went on a killing rampage in the forest. Their rampage ended when the father attacked his son, causing a lethal wound. The son only survived because a kind raven gave the father a leaf with healing powers. Many people who were accused of being werewolves centuries ago were just serial killers. France, weirdly enough, had several. In 1521, Pierre Burgot and Michael Verdun allegedly swore allegiance to the devil and claimed to have an ointment that turned them both into wolves. After confessing to brutally murdering several children, they were both burned to death at the stake. Burning was thought to be one of the few ways to kill a werewolf. Gilles Garnier, known as the Werewolf of Dole, was another 16th century Frenchman who claimed an ointment morphed him into a werewolf. As a wolf, he viciously killed children and ate them. He too was burned to death at the stake for his monstrous crimes. Peter Stube, a wealthy 16th century farmer in Bedburg, Germany, is considered by many to be the most notorious werewolf of them all. According to folklore, he turned into a wolf-like creature at night and devoured many citizens of Bedburg. Peter was eventually blamed for the gruesome killings after being cornered by hunters who claimed they saw him shapeshift from wolf to human form. He experienced a grisly execution after confessing under torture to savagely killing animals, men, women, and children, and eating their remains. He also declared he owned an enchanted belt that gave him the power to transform into a wolf at will. Not surprisingly, the belt was never found. Instead of actually being werewolves, it's way more plausible that these men, and others like them, were either mentally ill, hallucinating because of a foreign substance, or simply just psychopathic killers, or, as was probably the case for Peter Stube, they were framed because of a, no pun intended here, political witch hunt. Regardless of why, it didn't seem to matter to superstitious Europeans during the 16th century. To them, such heinous crimes could only be committed by the horrific beast known as the werewolf. Some legends maintain that werewolves shapeshift at will due to a curse. Others state that they transformed with the help of an enchanted sash or a cloak made of wolf pelt. Still, others claim people become infected after being scratched or bitten by an already existing werewolf. No matter the reason, every instance has always iterated how evil and destructive the werewolf is.
So even though there is a plethora of mythology and information on the legend of the werewolf, if there's no book or specific origin for him, then what is the original Wolfman based on? This is from a Google search I did.
While Dracula and Frankenstein were based on literary sources, there is no defining novel on which to base the Wolfman. As such, many details we associate with the werewolf legend, including the business with the full moon and the silver bullets, were invented by screenwriter Kurt Siodmak.
Interesting. Let's see how accurate that is. When I looked up the screenwriter Kurt Siodmak, I immediately saw a few things about him that piqued my interest.
The first is that he lived to be almost 100 years old. 1902 to 2000 is a long and crazy time to have lived. The second being, he was born in Dresden, Germany in 1902, and he was Jewish. Read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut if you don't know what happened to Dresden at the end of World War II. I'll give you a hint. If the Allies had lost the war and/or we never used nuclear weapons on Japan, the bombing of Dresden would be talked about similar to how we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki today. It was that bad. But no one talks about it because we nuked Japan and won the war. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but that's the gist of it. Before World War II, though, Kurt Siodmak had success as a novelist and in German films. That is, until he heard an anti-Semitic tirade by the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. He then decided to immigrate to England, where he made a living as a screenwriter before moving to the United States in 1937. His big break in Hollywood came in 1941 with the screenplay for, what else but, The Wolfman. This movie is what started it all. It established the Wolfman as the most popular movie monster after Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. What better company to be in? As I said earlier, in the film, Siodmak created several werewolf legends. The main ones being that werewolves are practically immortal, they can only be killed by being shot by silver bullets, and that their transformations happen during the full moon. On a side note, another fact about Kurt Siodmak that I found interesting was that he's the one who wrote the novel Donovan's Brain, which has been adapted into a movie on 2 separate occasions. If you're a horror fan, and you're like me, then you haven't seen that movie or read the book, but you read Stephen King's book on horror called Danse Macabre, where he discusses the novel and its subsequent movies at length. To create the Wolfman, in addition to werewolf history, Siodmak drew on his own experience being a Jewish person fleeing Nazi Germany. His own feelings of persecution and the horrors of the Holocaust greatly fueled him during the writing of the film. The Wolfman is, in essence, a metaphor for his own flight from the Nazis. Siodmak once said, "I am the Wolfman. I was forced into a fate I didn't want, to be a Jew in Germany."
In summation, Siodmak took parts of his life, combined them with the lore of the werewolves, and ended up changing the entire mythos of the creature into what we know it to be today. Now that we know the mythology of the werewolf and where the specific inspiration for the original 1941 Wolfman movie came from, then let's talk about what this new one can offer over 80 years later. What sets it apart from its predecessor?
The director of the 2025 version of The Wolfman, Leigh Whannell, made his feature film debut in 2004 because of another horror film that you've probably heard of. Along with James Wan, Whannell created Saw. I talk about Saw at length in another video. If you're interested, then check that out after this one. Whannell also directed the 2020 version of The Invisible Man, another Universal Monster movie remake, which I really liked. It was a very different take, but still horrifying. If he does with The Wolfman what he did with The Invisible Man, then I'm very much on board. Leigh Whannell has said that he drew inspiration for the 2025 film from multiple sources, including David Cronenberg's The Fly. Whannell was inspired by the way The Fly used practical effects to illustrate the tragedy of the human body falling apart. He was also inspired by the isolation and confinement of the COVID-19 pandemic. He wrote the first draft of the script in 2020 during lockdown and wanted that feeling to be present in the film. He took inspiration from several other werewolf films for the design of his Wolfman, including the original 1941 The Wolfman, An American Werewolf in London from 1981, The Howling from 1981, and Dog Soldiers from 2002. He was also inspired by Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker. To me, it sounds like Leigh Whannell is doing everything that he can to make his new version of the Wolfman the best that he possibly can. From practical effects to looking at his predecessors, having a great cast, and using personal experiences to fuel his ideas. As writers often say, write what you know. Combining all of this with 20 plus years of experience, the fact that he has written, directed, and been a part of several of my favorite horror movies, and that he just seems like a super nice and affable guy from Australia, I'm weirdly excited to see this new version of the Wolfman.
So let me know in the comments if you've seen the reboot by now, or if you plan on it. If you have, then what did you think? Was it better or worse than you thought? Have you seen any of the older Wolfman movies, or any of the other Universal Monster movies? Speaking of, if you want more in-depth looks at the likes of Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, then take a look at my videos on them, which can be found here. And let me know what other horror movies or books you'd like to know the story behind their story.